it's Amber. So today I want to talk about why we do what we do. So I'm just going to jump right into it. The first point I wanted to make and talk about was talking about more of our childhood self and how that motivates what we do today and what that looks like exemplified. So not everyone has childhood trauma, but based on ACE scores, ACE, it's figuring out of 10 questions how much or little childhood trauma a person might have. And based on that is a predictor of a lot of different things. It's really well noted in the book, The Body Keeps Score, by Van Der Kolk. So when we think back to childhood and think about our childhood traumas, I say traumas because I think people have a hard time identifying if it's a trauma or not. They're like, oh, it's not a trauma, it was so small, like, I remember it, but it wasn't significant to me. But it was still traumatic. So that's why I use quotes, not because people's trauma isn't traumatic, but actually the other way around. What people don't think is traumatic actually is. With that being said, I just want to put that aside. There are things in today's life, in our active present lives, where we feel vulnerable, we feel childish, we feel like we should be beyond something, we feel like it's immature or beneath us or ashamed about it. And a lot of those things come from, in my theory, a lot of these things come from childhood trauma. So when we think back to when doing something makes you feel like a child, like, okay, at what age, how old do you feel when you feel exposed in that way? How old does it make you feel? So one thing for me, for example, for me, socializing is very difficult. So when I feel like I need people to talk to me about how to socialize, I feel like a kid. I don't know an age for sure, but I feel very young, like before middle school. And when I think back to that time, okay, how did I spend my time? Well, I spent my time playing with my sister and cousin. And so when I'm able to think back to that, okay, why would that make me feel immature? Oh, well, they didn't respond well to me, so there must be something wrong with me because they responded well to each other. So that tells me, that's when the trauma started from that and the socialization. So when I'm how do you socialize? I feel so young and so vulnerable and exposed and raw. And that's because it takes me back to being young, and it makes me feel young, and I feel like other people look down on it, which isn't even the case. This storyline I tell myself isn't true necessarily, but just to throw that out there. So think about when it first started, and that's how you find out where it comes from. And then moving on, when you realize that, a lot of time when we're talking through with ourselves about how to handle these things, we're like, oh, we just need to let it go. And that's not how you handle it. Letting it go would require you to be very strong, and it would require a lot of self-determination from you, a lot of motivation. That would be very hard to do. The other side of the coin is, instead of letting it go, we can do inner child work, which you can look more into. Maybe I'll touch base with it another time, who knows. But inner child work you can do. So instead of forcing your adult self to let it go, it's pushing aside this younger version of you who needed to be validated and held in that way. And so now, instead of letting it go and pushing it aside, it's important to recognize that feeling, how it makes you feel, sit in it, and just hug yourself. For me, even just picturing a younger version of myself in that position, feeling those emotions so strongly and actively, just imagining myself hugging her or holding her hand or sitting on the couch with her, talking with her, it makes me feel so much better, and it's easier to work through, and in my opinion works through faster than just trying to get myself to let it go. So that is very essential. Moving on again, I'm just going to read it and then I'll discuss it. So you can never be a past version of yourself again, so stop trying to be. So a lot of times when we look back, for socialization, for example, younger me wasn't too good at it, high school me definitely wasn't good at it, but middle school me, I was very good at socialization. I was popular. The guys wanted to date me, all this stuff. And so when I think back to socialization, I'm like, man, I wish I could be as confident as I was then. I wish I could just talk to people like I did then. I wish I wouldn't have to worry so much about how they respond to me or what they think of me or how they react or their judgments like I did then. But then taking that time to say, I can never be that version of myself again, and I wouldn't want to be, because that girl didn't know as much as she knows now. So not only do I not want to be that, but being that wouldn't be negative because she had as much value as she did for where she was in her life. But looking at who I am now, I've grown so much that going back to that would be backwards is another word for it. But it would be going backwards because I've grown so much more now. I can embody that into who I am now and live it out even better because I've grown so much more from there. You can't go back to the version of yourself again. You can, however, look at past versions of yourself in terms of actions to decipher which were healthy and how to include them in your future. So when we look at past versions of ourselves, by that I mean what actions were healthy, what actions were not healthy. So middle school me, very good, very healthy in terms of socialization. I just talked to people, not strangers, I wasn't putting myself in danger, but I talked very confidently. I just had conversations that I wanted to. I didn't think much about it. And then high school me, I was very aware of conversations I had. I didn't really want to talk to anyone. So I can't go back to either version of myself, but I can look at those versions and say okay, what aspects, what actions did I take then that I liked? Which would I would say were healthy? Healthy would be the version of middle school me where I was talking with people confidently, just saying what I wanted to say, and I still cared about people, so I wasn't neglecting that. And so it's okay, so I really want to embody that again. Okay, what was unhealthy? Well, I did a lot of things for attention, and so those could be unhealthy. I would not want to go back to those. Okay, good. And then high school self, yes, I was overly conscious of what people were thinking. I don't want to go back to that. I was, however, it did help me become more aware of people's perceptions of how I come across or how something I say is interpreted, or that people can have triggers and different things like that. So you can look at these different actions of your past versions. I don't want to say past selves, same self, past versions of your same self, and decipher what's healthy, what's unhealthy, and what do I want to embody now? What do I wish I could go back to? Because if you wish to go back to it, it was probably healthy. If you don't wish to go back to it, look into that and figure out why it was unhealthy. My neighbors. Okay, going on to the next point. So this point just debunks a lot of the terminology I just used, and it's a constant reminder for myself as well, apparently. Look at stages of your life as healthy versus unhealthy rather than as versions of yourself. This is because you have the same motivations, it's the same self, just different actions, healthy versus unhealthy. So I'm going to unpack that. So when we look back on stages of our life as healthy versus unhealthy rather than as versions of ourselves. So the version of ourself remains the same. And bear with me, I know it doesn't sound correct, but I think it is. At least it's right. It might not be correct, but it's right. So at least to me, if you look back on yourself as different versions of yourself, it's more identity and definitive, and it's more you're choosing an exemplification of who you are. But if you look at yourself and your past self as healthy versus unhealthy, it gives credit to who you are, and it just looks at the actions rather than the identity of yourself. So you're not challenging your identity, you're just challenging those actions. Or rewarding those actions. You're evaluating those actions is a good word to use. Okay, so then why is it the same version of ourselves as we go through time? Because that sounds wrong, but I don't think it is. And that's because as you go through your life, you are your same self. Your self never changes. The only thing that changes is how you exemplify yourself, which are your actions. So those are the words we're going to be using is motivations. Motivations is who you are, and I would call that your identity, your values, the things that are instilled so deep in you, you might not even be able to recognize them because they're just so natural. And those are your motivations, versus your actions, which are the things you do in your life as you go through life. And those are exemplifications of your motivations. So that's why it's important to evaluate it as healthy versus unhealthy, because you're looking at the actions, not your motivations, because your motivations would be challenging your identity, which is the same. So if you challenge different versions of yourself and evaluate different versions of yourself, it's more detrimental to your self-worth because you're evaluating essentially all the core values that you have, everything that's so deep within you, instead of evaluating your actions and exemplifications of yourself. I hope that stuck. The next thing is motivations versus actions. So disclaimer, I don't believe that I want to make sure I say it right. I don't believe that our actions tell us much about ourselves or other people. And here's why. Because our actions are exemplifications of our motivations and our personality, our core, our identity. So when we act, it like branches off of motivation. Like there are so many actions you can do for each motivation of your identity. And so our actions, so it's like, there's like a branch, right? And then the branch is motivation. And then off of this motivation, there are tons of different actions you can do. But then your actions, there's another branch over here with a different motivation, and they align with a lot of the same actions. So your actions tell very little about your motivation, even though you can try to figure it out because some actions just don't make sense with other motivations. But for the most part, your actions just don't say as much. So then, with that being said, our actions tell us very little about ourselves. They only tell us our interests, how we grew up, because how we grew up can be telling about how we act now because of what we learned. Comfort zones, self-care and coping skills are both exemplified by our actions because it's, once again, something that we've learned or not learned. And then self-discipline, once again, learn, not learn. Anything you can learn or not learn are our actions, and that's what they tell us about ourselves. Like, yeah. We find who we are by looking at the motivations behind our actions. So when we look at our actions, like we have a little web of actions, when we look at this motivation branch, you can tell a lot about your motivation. Like once you identify which motivation, like here's your actions. Okay, what actions am I doing? Which motivation, there's probably like a ton of them, but like what motivation is leading to those actions. And once we figure out what motivation it is, we can learn a lot more about ourselves. When I learned that I need people's validations, I can be like, oh, that's because so-and-so didn't validate me growing up, so now I feel like I need to get that somewhere else, and I feel like I have to be good in order to get that, so now I'm also a people pleaser. Like, look at how much I've learned about myself just by figuring out where my action's coming from, and that's just like the surface, and not the surface, it's, I don't know, middle ground? I don't know. Not the surface, because the surface is actions. And then, once we learn more about ourselves from our motivations, we can find motivation patterns from past to present. So once we figure out what our motivation is, so one thing that really motivates me is a fear of loss. I lost a friend to suicide in high school, so that has really impacted me and given me a strong fear of loss. Knowing that motivation, that leads to the actions for me of codependency, lack of boundaries, and acting according to perceived expectations. So I act people-pleasing, basically. So these are all of the actions based on this motivation. So once I can work through with a qualified therapist, counselor, my motivation and trying to reframe it to make it not fear-based, but rather a lesson learned, or lessons learned, there's probably a lot more in there, but then we can work forward in healing ourselves. But if we're just looking at our actions, like if we're just trying to heal my codependency, we're just trying to give myself better boundaries, we're just trying to stop me from people pleasing, it's so much harder to treat because we're not actually looking at the wound, we're looking at the Band-Aid. So we're like, oh, gotta change the Band-Aid. And it's like, yeah, of course you do, but you have to change the Band-Aid because the wound is bleeding out and you're not stopping it, like, and like, yeah, the Band-Aid slows it down, but like, if you rate, maybe like, okay, here's my visual of that. The wound is on your finger, right? So the wound is on your finger, and that is your motivation. And when our motivation is causing us to have unhealthy actions, we have to treat the wound. If we treat the actions, which is the Band-Aid, then the wound will still be hurting. And it might kind of get healed over a little bit, but the wound is what actually has to heal. So one thing you can do to heal the wound is put it above your heart, which is like not common, I guess some people know that, some people don't, about to stop bleeding or slow bleeding, you put it above your heart because the way your heart moves your blood around your body. That's important for this example. So when we put it above our heart, we're actually healing the wound to some extent. We're slowing it down, we're working through it, and we're exposing it more. It can't be hidden when it's held up. So we expose our motivations, once again, to a trusted individual or a qualified therapist or counselor, and then we can treat so then by treating that wound, it heals us more. So looking at, when we look at these patterns of motivation patterns, then we're able to figure out what the motivation is, and we can treat the wound. and you look at motivation patterns by compiling all of your actions that stay consistent, that you have a similar feeling behind. So like me trying to get validation, that's a similar feeling all throughout my life, even though I have different actions. And so once we figure out my motivation, we look at the pattern of my motivations. Oh, this has been consistent. This motivation has been consistent, even though the actions have changed, and that's the wound to work on and work on healing. And then final point is someone else's opinion of you is none of your business. So while you're working through this stuff, while you're figuring out why you do what you do, while you're living out different actions, trying to find one that really suits you in terms of your exemplification of motivation, which is all our actions are. All of our actions ever are just exemplifications of our motivations. And those aren't bad, those are actually good, because otherwise we'd be doing nothing all the time. So anyway, so someone else's opinion of you is none of your business. So while you're working through this, if someone doesn't like something and they don't say it, that's none of your business. And if they do say it, I guess it's a whole nother tangent, but like you have to evaluate whether or not it's someone who you give value to their opinion of. So like if it's Joe Schmo on the street says something about you, disregard. But if a close friend says, hey, I've noticed this about you, and presents it well and lovingly to you, then that's something to evaluate and look at, healthy versus unhealthy, and looking at their motivation behind it as well, because their action of calling it out in you is also motivation from them. But when we have healthy motivations is when we can healthfully heal other people around us and put more positive and good into the world, rather than projecting fear or any kind of motivation rooted in something that's less productive than if it were to be rooted in something positive. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and take care. Subscribe, like, comment, notification bell, all those things. Give me feedback. Let me know if this is something you resonate with, and I will see you next time.